Okay, and before Susan presents, Magnus Ugg from the Committee to Protect Journalists is going to talk a little bit about what their organization does, and they also provided the book, so feel free to take one home.
Thank you, and thanks, Sandy, for suggesting I should just present our organization. We're a 32-year-old organization, so we've been around for a while, protecting journalists, the press freedom organization, based a few blocks over on 7th Avenue, founded by American journalists back then that saw journalists around the world in need for some kind of help, don't have the same protections as the American journalists have or had. That said, the field of journalism, as you all know, has changed a lot. That's why I'm here today. We see of the 70 journalists killed last year, I think 44% worked online or published their material online. Of the journalists imprisoned on December 1st last year, that was 211. I think more than 100 of them worked online. So the organization has kind of been forced to switch gears from protecting these traditional journalists that went out into the field or worked for local media, but some kind of established organization, right? If you work for the New York Times and travel, you have the New York Times backing you when you get in trouble. But if you work online, if you're blogging, we have a very wide definition of who's the journalist. If you're blogging during the Mubarak era in Egypt and gets in trouble, who's going to help you then? And that's where really our mandate has grown, and we've bigger demand of our resources and very difficult task. On top of that, then you have the whole digital security aspect. I won't get too much into it. There's much people that know a lot more about that here. But that's a key issue for us to bring to journalists to say it's really important that you protect yourself and your sources. So we're doing some work in that. We're also trying to bridge the gap to the tech community and telling Facebook that this Ethiopian newspaper is actually using Facebook to publicize their material because their website was taken down, their paper version was confiscated, and now Facebook ended up taking their page down because they had too many requests to take it down, but we could then facilitate that discussion that this was a legit good opposition newspaper in Ethiopia, and Facebook then restored the connection. So that's kind of where some of the organization is moving. The core is still documenting press freedom violations, so as you can see in this book and on our website, cpj.org, we spend a lot of time just documenting and blasting out when there's a press freedom violation somewhere in the world. We have regional programs that get in every day, work very much like a news agency, get tips, read local news, and then report on it. Straightforward journalistic reporting. This journalist was killed, this journalist was imprisoned, here are the reasons. Then we throw in an advocacy, like a quote in the press release that we send out. That's kind of our position on the topic. You got to release this, or you got to investigate that, or whatever it might be. And that's kind of like the second core function of the organization is our advocacy work. So based on all this data that we have, like number of killed journalists or specific detailed descriptions of what happened in one case, we take that to different political systems. It can be big UN, EU, cross-national, or it can be a local government or a mayor somewhere and say, you got to do something about this case, or release that guy, or investigate that murder. 90% of all the murder of journalists go unpunished, so there's a lot of work for us there in getting justice in these cases. What's most relevant to you guys is probably our internet advocacy program that is run by a guy named Jeff King. He's based in San Francisco. I'm sure you'll come by if we can time it sometime and give a more thorough presentation of what he does. But he leads our internet work. We are trying to engage more and more. We've had this internet program. Danny O'Brien started it. Some of you might know him. He's back with EFF now, but Jeff is doing great work continuing our efforts there. We're hiring a staff technologist to do more of this, and that's basically why I'm here giving you an old school book, is to come join us, help us protect these journalists around the world. There's a lot of them that don't know what they can get out of tech and how they can use it safely, and they really need the help, and we need the help as an organization that's trying to protect these journalists, but as you know, it's a fast-moving environment, so happy to take any questions. Maybe one or two now, and then I'll stick around and can talk more after we hear a very interesting presentation here in a while.
Why don't we leave the questions to the very end?
Okay.
We'll go use that poll.
Yeah, that's fine.
So everybody knows who Susan is, right? She's the director. Yeah, well, I don't know if it's right. But the one thing I wanted to say, so my organization supports the open source community behind these tools, and we have these events twice a year in international locations. And one of the reasons that I thought of having Susan come is because she's a journalist that really has a good cultural understanding of the tech environment. She may not code, but she's a very good liaison and ambassador. So if there's any journalists here, I would really recommend that you reach out to her afterwards, because she's an awesome asset. So
thank you. Thank you, Magnus. And I do code, but not as much as I used to. Yeah, thank you so much, Sandy. I just want to say thank you to ThoughtWorks for letting us use this great space, and also to OpenITP, which has been so my research at Columbia, as Sandy mentioned, I'm the assistant director of the Tao Center for Digital Journalism. We were started about 3.5 years ago at Columbia Journalism School. And in the last couple of years, as I've sort of grown more aware of some of the issues in digital privacy and security, particularly both from a technical and from a legal perspective, I've been doing a lot of research and work in this area. And I'm currently working on a white paper that the Tao Center will publish in the next couple of months, kind of addressing the sort of conceptual underpinnings of the various technical and legal situations, and kind of making recommendations. But OpenITP has been really invaluable for me in this process. I would say that 70 to 90% of the people that I've met, like yourselves, who really know what's going on in this space, I've met through OpenITP and OTI and other organizations. And it's been a really, really valuable education for me. So I just wanted to say thank you. These are kinds of things that in the course of my research I've sort of seen as being kind of like problems that I see underlying the lack of adoption of security practices, digital security practices in journalism, right? So I think for all of you certainly, and some of us in the community who understand how technology works, you know, the idea that this kind of monitoring and surveillance and infringements of privacy were happening was not necessarily such a shock, right? It was pretty well understood that this could happen. And then, of course, we had the events of last spring in the journalism world, everything from the government seizure of the AP's phone, the Associated Press phone records, you know, through obviously, you know, the Edward Snowden revelations. You know, was the first time that it was kind of like out in public that this stuff was going on for real. We know it's documented. You know, this isn't speculation anymore. And you'd think that that would have a really dramatic effect, right? All of a sudden, everybody would be concerned about it, and you would see sort of this seismic shift in practices. And while a lot of people, I mean, certainly I can speak from experience. I was working on a research project for secure digital communication 2 years ago, and I went to one of the big digital journalism conferences in 2012, and we were trying to sort of talk to people about this application and say, oh, this is good and it's secure, and they were kind of like, oh, I work in the US, I don't need to worry about it, right? So that people are sort of aware now that there is more going on, but they still really lack the resources to do much about it. And so what I'm going to sort of speak to you about this evening, hopefully pretty briefly, is what I think, you know, what I've sort of seen those issues to be that are really blocking adoption and making it difficult for journalists and journalistic organizations to really do the things that they need to do to protect themselves and to protect their sources. So this is a quote, many of you may know Octavia. She's a trainer. I was speaking with her actually at an OpenITP event last October, and in our conversation, in the course of our conversation, she said this. She said, most people did not choose to have computers in their lives, right? And for those of us who love technology and work with technology and build with technology, it's exciting, it's empowering, it's awesome. For a lot of people, it is not something they wanted. It is not, or it's not something they chose. And so understanding that, first of all, for a lot of people, technology feels imposed. It feels like something that they have to use because their job requires it, et cetera, and it feels foreign and it feels alien and it feels sometimes kind of scary. And that's something that, particularly in the journalistic world, is true in many cases. to look at the sort of the context of the journalism industry, journalism is an enormous state of upheaval, both technological and kind of psychosocial, right? We have this question of what does it mean to be a professional journalist? Do we need professional journalists? What is the role of journalism in society? All of these things are in an enormous state of flux, to say nothing of the fact that the mechanisms through which we publish and distribute journalism have just, literally shifted 100% in the last 15 years, right? Most of the people who are in the industry, it tends to be a sort of lifetime career for folks. They've been in the industry for 20, 30 years. I used to work at the Wall Street Journal, and when the Wall Street Journal was purchased by News Corp in 2009, the people who were leaving then had been there 20, 30 years very often. I still had colleagues when I left there who had been there for over 20 years. So what you're talking about is something that operated in a particular way for a really long time, largely outside of technology, and then has gone through this enormous transition. And the other thing is that and sort of part and parcel to this is the fact that the publication system used to be really compartmentalized, right? Your job as a journalist was to report, to write, and then you shipped your copy off at the end of the day, right? You wrote text and you sent it away, and somebody else dealt with it. And that is not the case anymore. And so now there are all these layers of that sort of publication and distribution system that are part of your job, interspersed throughout your day on a day-to-day basis. And that's just a lot more to contend with, and it's frankly just a lot more work. And especially if you think of that in the context of somebody who doesn't really understand technology, again, maybe didn't really choose technology, that's a lot to lay on, especially in an industry that is going through a lot of downsizing. So the consequence of this is that one thing is that there's a lot of outmoded assumptions about the efficacy of existing legal protections, right? So we look at things like shield laws, or shield laws, they're not all laws, but shield protections, which give journalists in certain contexts the right to protect their sources. The reality is that because of the way that technological systems work, as many of you know, these are effectively moot in most cases, right? You're never going to get to court to say, I won't tell you who my source is, because they're going to find out by looking at who you've been corresponding with on Gmail. They're going to find out by looking at the metadata on your phone records. But because people don't really understand how those systems work, there's sort of still this like print era thing of like, right, but we have shield laws, right? The fact that those are no longer effective in the same way is not really understood by a lot of people. As I've sort of been alluding to, this kind of information overload relationship to digital communications, I didn't find the link, but it brought to mind a column that was written by Walt Mossberg, who was formerly the sort of tech writer at the Wall Street Journal when I was there when the iPad came out, and it was like this kind of sarcastic response to the notion that like, oh, there's another piece of technology I have to get, and he was kind of like, actually legally you're not required to get an iPad, right? But there is this feeling for people who don't understand this stuff that there's just one more thing, right? There's always another thing, there's always another system, there's always another social network. It's hard. It's really, really hard. And then, of course, there's kind of this cultural ambivalence within the journalism industry, right? Is technology really improving things? It's common for every generation to say, the kids these days, and all they want to do is read, listicles and all that stuff, right? And so I think the fact that there's been so much change and that it has really been kind of this, again, this seismic shift, sort of generationally, that you also have this deep cultural ambivalence that causes people to genuinely resist adoption. So what are the main obstacles? One of the main obstacles is that most journalists, and frankly most people, have no idea how digital communication systems work, right? They just don't know what's happening. They don't understand how the signals are maintained. They don't understand what's being sent, right? They just don't get it. And that's not terribly surprising, because when would they ever have been taught, right? These are not things that get covered in our K through 12, although that may be changing. So they don't really have a mental model for this. Anybody who's like a Don Norman fan, the design of everyday things, what you know is that if you don't have a solid mental model of how something works, then it's very difficult to establish cause and effect. And particularly when we think about digital information systems, the risks and effects are not obvious, right? I mean, the fact that you use an unsecured website one day and then 6 months later, you're the victim of credit card fraud, like, you're not going to be able to put those two events together. There's high latency and there's a lot of invisibility. And so having a framework for how these systems work, I think, is one of the fundamental things that most people are lacking. So I guess one of the things I would say is that, before we try to sort of tell people about tools to use and things like that, is like make sure they understand what's happening, right, when they do these things. So I'm gonna blow through this because it's something that I think probably everyone in this room understands. This is actually an excerpt essentially from a presentation I gave a couple weeks ago at the National Institute for Computer Assisted Reporting conference on this topic, which was informational for journalists. It's a journalism audience, but basically just sort of looking at like, this is what happens like when you communicate between two devices, and kind of highlighting the various places that you can have risks and threats to your information using insecure wireless. Legal threats, which is a really big one for us, right? If you're storing information digitally, whether it's Google Docs or email or whatever, that you can really easily, the government in particular can really easily get legal sort of missives to access that information. And what do we want to do? Well, we want to encrypt, make sure that you do, endpoint security is obviously huge. It's something that I think people take for granted, that like, oh, I can leave my MacBook out because like nobody's going to steal it, which I still think is amazing. But that you shouldn't do that, and you do need to like encrypt your drive. A lot of this stuff is actually pretty simple, but understanding why it's vulnerable and sort of how these different layers protect it, I think is really important. And of course, one of the challenges is that the sort of top level answer in most cases is encrypt, right? Encrypt everything, encrypt all the time if you can. And one of the big challenges is, what are the sort of resources available with which to do that? We'll get to that in a second. Also, the idea of sort of diversity. I really love the fact that sort of like thinking about your service use as like an ecology where you want as much diversity as possible, because if people are going to use a legal attack and try to get your information, if they have to go to 5 different organizations, it's going to take them a lot longer and be a lot harder than if they only have to call Google. So, in thinking about sort of what's the mandate for this for journalists, when I first started doing research in this area, I was collaborating with computer scientists, and in computer science, a lot of times you've got a lot of hammers without a lot of nails. And I was working with my colleagues, and they were sort of asking, well, how are we going to get people to use this? And I said, the one thing is that is core for journalists is source protection, right? That is one of our mandates. We must, it's like do no harm, right? You must protect your sources. Now, the fact that most people don't know how to do this effectively doesn't mean that they don't care about it. And so this is a really key thing that you can work with, I think, when you're, if you're working with journalists to kind of help them understand what they need to do. But I think one of the things that was most powerful for me in sort of learning about this space was understanding different layers of anonymity, like understanding the difference between like anonymity, pseudonymity, and linkability, right? And so most of the time what journalists need is content protection, right? Mostly what we need is we need to be able to encrypt our email, we need to be able to encrypt our chats so that, somebody just like kind of looking at the thing can't get access to it. So if you do get that subpoena for email, we basically will find out about it, right? I mean, the real challenge is that, the real issue with the legal situation is that this information can be obtained and you will never know. So even if you do have the New York Times behind you ready to throw the full force of their legal weight, if they're never notified, they never have a chance to file that motion, right? They never have the chance to resist. So most of the time, what we need is content protection. We need encrypted messages and messaging. Less frequently, we need to worry about things like unlinkability, right? Not being able to trace my communication to another, that I'm communicating with another person. And I'm, again, I think probably most of the people in this room understand how that might work. But it's mostly to say that, like, I think one of the things that we're looking at is helping people distinguish from the everyday, which is like being able to do the encryption all the time and with everyone. Versus situations where you need unlinkability, you need to be able to know that you can communicate with this person digitally and nobody's going to be able to tie it back either to you or to them or both, right? Because in some cases, source protection is, it's going to be about whether your source just being seen to communicate with a journalist is going to be a liability for your source. And this is usually where experts are going to need to come in, right? And one of the big challenges is that most places don't have those experts. But these are kind of the main use cases for digital security practices in journalism in a large scale. This is my colleague Jonathan Stray. You know, we're allowed to make choices about risks to ourselves, not our sources. Again, I think this is a really succinct way of kind of articulating the source protection issue in journalism. So what are the practical obstacles? This is the fun part. What are the practical obstacles to using secure software, secure communication software? Number one is usability, okay? Like hands down, I've set some of this stuff up myself. I've seen what it takes to set it up. It's hard. It's hard, it's multi-step, you know, the language is basically such that if you don't, I mean, most people, again, this is like I mean, you know, this is, you know, I don't want to choose like a sort of archetypal character that this is like, right? But people who don't know anything about their computers, right? They don't know what operating system they're on, right? You know, you go to set up a GPG key and like there is so much stuff there. And, you know, and that's what you have to do though. That's the only system that's available really if you want to be doing something like encrypted email. Even setting up Thunderbird, right, which is like a pretty straightforward thing, is still pretty complicated when you come down to it. I mean, I know I accidentally deleted like, I don't know, 3-4 years worth of emails when I was doing that, right? So the point is that, you know, and we're starting to see some of this, right? We're starting to see things like, you know, Silent Circle and Wicker and all these other things. But what we need is we need secure tools that have consumer level usability, right? Like that is like number one, hands down, the easiest thing you can do. Like you don't have to convince people to use it if it's easy to use, right? People are out there, I mean, we see this, right? I mean, and unfortunately kind of scarily what we see is we see people just like jumping at, you know, grabbing at whatever the next thing is because they do want it. Right? Like we see people going to WhatsApp and Telegram and Snapchat and all this stuff, right? And unfortunately, I mean, I feel like it's probably killing you guys, right? That we don't actually have any idea how secure most of this stuff is. But, right, you do. Well, exactly. And therefore, I would imagine that pains you. It would pain me in your position, right? But the point is that if it's super usable, then people will use it. And it will be great that it also is secure and you can feel confident about that. Kind of to that end though, right, lack of authority. There aren't that many experts out there, right? I'm not sure how we solve that problem. Maybe there are tons of people and they're just not visible, and that's the problem. But you know, it's like I think about it when I see these things come out, and I'm like, you know, I know who I would ask, right? And I know that there are some people that I can look to, but the idea of having kind of and I know actually that, you know, OpenITP has just, you know, established the peer review board, which is awesome, and I'm super excited about it, you know, but the question is like, how do people find this out? And also the sort of,
It is small, like the community.
Yes, yeah, I mean, it is genuinely small, but I think, you know, thinking about, you know, if you are somebody with those skills and thinking about how to be a communicator about that, and also like really focusing on kind of being communicative, which we'll get to in the next one. This is actually probably the biggest one for me, is the lack of sustainability. Okay, so lots of open source tools out there. Many of them, I think, very good in their sort of security, working on the usability side. There is an insurmountable challenge in the fact that if you are working on a product that is funded by grants, not because it's funded by grants and not who's paying the grants, but because it might be gone in 2 years, no enterprise business can ever use it. Flat out, hands down. The New York Times is gonna, you know, or whoever, right? It costs millions of dollars to train people on software, right? To install it, to maintain it, you know, to install it, to set it up, to maintain it, to train people. You simply cannot undertake that investment if you're not sure it's going to be around. And that's, I would say, one of the biggest problems is that, you know, I've seen some really fantastic projects, but because of the way they're funded, you can't go, I mean, you know, Silent Circle, I think, is now being used in the Times newsroom precisely because they can pay for it and they know that it's going to be around, right? You can set up a contract. That's a business arrangement that you can strike. And to be perfectly honest, too, you know, the trickle-down effect for the little guys or the independent people is going to come once you get institutional adoption, right? Like, once there's somebody out there using it, once it becomes the norm in the industry, that's where you're going to get the ability for other people to do uptake, right? And I mean, that's sort of my message when I talk to journalists about using things like encryption, is that, like, if you really want to help out the people overseas who need to, you know, who need to be able to have access to this stuff, who need this, this software, be the one to use it yourself, because it becomes so mainstream that you just can't block it. That's when it becomes available to those people. But as long as it's those little bits of usage, it's a red flag more than anything. So actual opportunities, right? There are good things that we can do because in light of this. One is to prioritize usability, identify a genuine user group, identify their goals and their pain points, and work to solve them together, right? It's a student that I worked with a couple years ago put it best when he said, security is not a goal, right? It's not a task. People are trying to get other things done. And then they either do them in a way or with tools that are secure or not, right? So in honesty, the way that we get this stuff done is to recognize what the tasks are that people are trying to accomplish, and then help them do those things securely, whether that's building a piece of software or developing a protocol, whatever it is. That's how we get security ingrained, right? It's not a feature that people go for. They can't overcome the fact that they have something else to do simply to do security, right? It's not an end goal in that way. Improve authoritative resources. If you have this knowledge, please share it. I mean, there are some great people out there who write blog posts and stuff like that. But also, again, this should be done in the context of there are people trying to get things done. I know not firsthand, but I know that there are always problems with. There are always some problems with everything, right? Nothing is perfect. But the idea of identifying where the weak points are, or saying, this thing is really good for accomplishing X, right? It might be total crap at something else. I think one of the things that we have is we have a tendency to talk about security in a binary way, right? It either is secure or it's not secure. Like, it might be secure for one thing or one piece of the puzzle, but not for the other thing, right? That's the kind of articulation that people who don't have technical backgrounds need in order to understand how to apply this stuff. And develop sustainably. What I see, there was an article that somebody put out the other day that was like, why Red Hat would never survive, why you could never have Red Hat again. But consider if there's an opportunity for a service and support model to fund your project, right? Like, if you go through this, if you find a community that needs what you're doing, and certainly there are great grant organizations out there that are trying to sort of help fund this and also provide the transition, but build that in. Charge people $10 a month, charge them $20 a month. Like, figure out, as you go into this, figure out what you need in order to make this something that you can actually maintain. Because if it can be sustained, then that's something that can also grow. If it can't be sustained, it can never grow, right? It just can't move forward. So this is just also like a couple of things that I sort of see coming over the horizon that are actually less software based and more hardware based potentially. But I'm not sure. Some of this is actually kind of on journalism, and this has to do with the whole concept of how we view privacy and publishing. I'm not sure how many of you guys saw this story last fall, but it's a really interesting and I think kind of an ominous story for publications and for life on the web. The concept of privacy in the US is kind of this no privacy in public, right? If you do something in public, it's not private, and therefore you don't have any right to privacy. And there was a story, the story that I mentioned was in the New York Times, and it was about a bunch of websites that had started gathering, so mugshots are public in the United States, and very often they're now available digitally. And a couple of enterprising folks started scraping together collections of mugshots and posting them online, such that very quickly they became the #1 Google search results for the people in the mugshots. Of course, you get a mugshot if you're arrested. It doesn't mean you're guilty of anything. Whatever. It doesn't mean anything. But basically, people were running into problems where they were applying for a job and somebody Googled them, and the first thing that comes up is their mugshot, and they're like, oh, and then they don't get the job, right? That's bad. So the reporter is like calling these websites and saying, oh, what's going on? And they say, well, for $300, we'll take it down. Or, yeah, if you can prove that nothing, you didn't really do anything and all this stuff. And the reporter also calls Google and says, hey, Google, like, what do you think of this? Like, these mugshots are showing up, page 1. How do you feel? And they're like, it's the algorithm, not our problem, or like, that's kind of bad, but we can't do anything about it. And then they call Visa and PayPal and MasterCard and all the places that are processing the payments. And I don't know what the length of, I actually really want to interview the reporter. I don't know what the length of the reporting was, but apparently like a day and a half later, this ran on a weekend, so it was like a day or two later, the person from Google calls the reporter back and says, you know what? Turns out we were working on that. And we made a tweak to the algorithm, and lo and behold, the reporter goes, and now you Google that person's name, and the search results are on like page 4. Nobody goes to page 4, or not enough. It's true, right? Nobody goes to page 4. If they do, there's something going on. And of course, before you go to press, you always kind of check back with everybody you've talked to, and so they go and they call back and they check back with Visa and MasterCard, PayPal. And it turns out Visa and MasterCard and PayPal go, yeah, actually, we think this is really terrible. We're not going to process payments to those people anymore. We've decided we're gonna cut off the hose there. And so, of course, lastly, the reporter follows up with the site owners, and it's a pretty grim picture for them. There they were out on the front of Google search results. They were making money. They've got it. They've got visibility. They've got cash coming in. And now, in the space of like 3 days, nothing. It's over, right? Nobody's going to see them. Nobody's going to find them. They can't get paid, even if somebody did find them and wanted to pay them. The thing is basically that so this is great. Like, we all love it when the bad guys get their due, right? Like, it was a mean thing to do. And for journalism, this poses a little bit of a challenge, because the sort of pat answer is, the sort of pat response to the idea of mugshots being public is like, these are public records, they should stay public, they're important. I don't think that's a sufficient answer. I think that there's a different level of publicness that comes with publication, and I think that's something that we as an industry and a profession need to sort out, how we're going to manage that. We've lost access to public records. This slide was the Westchester gun map that was published about 1.25 years ago, and it was in December, also in incredibly poor taste, and with no real journalistic value. But the consequence is if you publish a lot of public records and say, hey, it's a public record, then people go, not anymore. And then you lose access to that information. But as they say to me, the really big, the sort of ominous thing about that mugshot story is that what you have is you have access to information, and you have access to funds cut off wholly by private entities, right? Google decides to change their algorithm, and they're not on page 1 anymore, and they are effectively dead in the water. Obviously, everyone in this room is familiar with WikiLeaks. We know what happened, when the credit card companies decide that they are not going to process payments anymore. And it made me really think about, well, okay, fine, it's the jerk with the, it's the jerk with the mugshot website today, but what might it be in the future, right? We understand how the internet is censored in other countries, and there's, we've got a broadband, we've got a cable merger going through right now, right? The number of hands controlling access is shrinking. And you could see that it would actually not be that difficult, to kind of flip the switch on a publication, right? Which in a country that espouses freedom of the press would be really, really damaging. And so one of the things that this has made me think about is, the fact that one of the big changes technology has wrought. In general, journalism, we have owned our distribution network, right? So you sort of look back to the early 20th century and sort of what was standard par for the course. You own the printer, you employ the distributors, you own all the content, you have a direct line to your readers. And I think that, I know that organizations like OTI, I think that the idea of working with distributed networks and the fact, of course, that something that is working off of a very small local wireless network is not going to be as traceable, I think has, bless you, has a lot of promise and a lot of potential. I think it's something that not just in other countries, but also here, it's something that I say, I think in journalism, we also need to think about is how are we going to, how are we going to make sure that we can get our information out there no matter what happens. So that is all from me. Thank you very much for your attention. If anybody has questions, let me know. Answered them all. Yes.
Thoughts on Tor?
Sorry?
What are your thoughts on Tor?
As a tool?
Yeah.
I mean, my understanding of Tor is that it is widely accepted to do what it does, which is good. I think my understanding too is that there's like not enough people hosting nodes. There's a lot of people using it, not enough people hosting. And I think, I think something like the Tor browser bundle is a great example, right? Like that's like download, double click, you're done. Everything kind of goes. I think the biggest issue with Tor again is just the way that people understand and use it, right? And so I guess one thing I would say is like the idea when people say like, oh, it's for anonymous web browsing, right? Like that's a huge umbrella, right? Like I think the more specificity we can get in like what this thing does, right? Like it obscures your location and kind of disperses your traffic, right? In a way that makes tying it together difficult, right? But if you go on Tor and log into Gmail, it's not going to help much, So I think that being really, really concise and really specific about how we characterize what specific tools do is really, really important to making sure that they're improving the chances of they're being used correctly. Yeah.
Just to follow up on that, we had a really good example, speaking of mental models, of how people think of Tor when that kid tried to email in a bomb threat to Harvard to stop his exam from happening. Right, so his apparent mental model was Tor is magical invisibility cloak that covers everything I do, which basically left him open to the one major vulnerability that Tor has. Whereas if you are going into it within a network and coming out of it within the same network, anybody watching the network, like the sysadmin at your school, can see where it comes and goes out, and that's how they confidence. So, yeah, I mean, like if we're teaching people, we need to make it clear. We do need to make it much clearer how these things work and what the potential vulnerabilities are.
Yeah, and I think in truth with something like Tor, it's like those are kind of the two cases, right? Like, don't log into an authenticated system that is attached to your identity, and like be aware that if you're inside a country where the entire where you don't get out of it, like it's a low latency network that can be watched. That that could tie it back to you.
So the EFF has this pretty long set of recommendations for journalists. I forget what the acronym is, but there's this big banner at the top that says this is an outdated list of recommendations. Don't rely on this, basically. I mean, what's a good resource for this kind of stuff?
Yeah, I'm hoping that my paper will be kind of a good resource. No, I think that's a really good question though, and again, like that is the. My paper actually won't be a good resource for that because it's not really addressing tools. Yeah, CPJ does.
The outdated band. We have a journalist security guide, and the physical part, like the physical security.
Yeah, OPSEC is.
But we have a digital one that's written pre-NSA Snowden, so it's like still needs an update too. So we would have the same disclaimer. But if you're in Syria and it's the Syrian Digital Army, there might be some good advice there still. We just didn't take into account what the NSA is capable of.
Yeah, I think the short answer is that we have not yet coalesced around one thing, but that is something that would be great to do, and I think resourcing that is really valuable. Gus?
The other resource I'm aware of right now is the Level Up Project.
Yes.
Interviews. They are accumulating best practices at the moment. That is sort of in the works. Keep an eye on that.
Yeah. Yes.
Thanks again for a great talk.
Thank you.
Endpoint security, and
yes.
More from the perspective of kind of like physical security, like tilting your MacBook out or encrypting drives. I'm a little curious what your thoughts are on like operating system security, specifically the projects like Tails.
Yeah. So I think again, like something like I think Tails. The way that I understand that most people would use it is basically to. Is if you don't have like a separate machine that you can use for stuff. And I think it's a great idea. Again, I actually haven't used it myself, but the way that I understand that people use it is, like you kind of like plug it in and boot it up, and then you do things that you need to have not your, be your identity from within it. And I think it's a great approach. Again, like I think that once you understand what each piece does, it's not that hard to kind of get your head around. And the idea that, well, you know, I understand that my, you know, kind of no matter what I do, like if I'm on my own computer, on any version of my own computer, you know, there are going to be cookies, there's going to be all this stuff that kind of just labels it as me. And it's much easier to then, as a matter of course, to say, okay, I'm going to plug in Tails and I'm going to do a, you know, a certain kind of work from that. I think anything that has that kind of straightforward application is really, really valuable, because again, it's easy to say, it's easy for people to think about, like, when I do that, this is the procedure that I follow, right? And it isn't part of this big giant mess. Yeah.
So, I mean, one of the things that was fascinating to me is you started out and just talked about the journalism industry, because people tend to abstract it away from actually what's going on in the industry. So my early jobs at a college were publishing firms where people were going from typewriters to 286s.
Right.
And it was insane to watch people who, like, you know, dropped out of high school at 16 and now had to understand how SMTP worked.
Right.
Am I still going to get my email if the computer's off? You know?
Right.
what happens to it? Does the postman not show up? You know? That whole mentality. But also, I mean, it just seems like the craft mentality, the guild thing, I guess we talked about before, that goes on in journalism. I mean, so people have their ways and their adjustments and so on. The fact that people have actually come to the point where digital is so central to their trade today, to me, is remarkable. I mean, I think that's great. But also, I think there's a wonderful advantage of journalism where distinguishing between privacy and anonymity, you could sit there and argue with anybody and say privacy. Well, you have something to be private. You have you have locks on your doors. You wear clothes. Something. You know, you can hit somebody on that. But anonymity is a lot harder. But with journalists, it seems to me, that's actually an easier argument.
Super easy. Super easy, yeah. I mean, it's because it's source protection, right? Again, it's like, you know, you can go out and do whatever reckless thing you want to do, but if you're putting your source at risk, then you know, that's not really defensible, you know? And somebody made a comment, actually, I was having another talk on this last semester, and some folks from Tor and everybody came in, and it was interesting because it was like, you know, the irony is, you know, almost any, you know, any journalist or aspiring journalist, you know, would sort of, you know, this sort of, I think they call it the cowboy mentality, right? Like, I would go to jail to protect my source. It's like, you would go to jail, but you wouldn't use Tor, right? Like, there's some cognitive dissonance there, right? But in a way, like, that's the way it needs to be presented, right? Is like, you know, you gotta own the actual thing that's happening, but you can only do that, like, people can, you know, first of all, it seems like, you know, exciting and sexy, like, ha, you know, I'm a hero, but at the same time, like, I can conceive of, like, what that means, maybe, you know, whereas the other stuff is much harder to hang on to.
But just, sorry, just follow up on that. But also, it just seems like, and I know I actually wrote something quite similar to something you wrote, except mine was not nearly as refined or clean or clear. But when you wrote, like, basically, like, post-Snowden journalists, right? Like, I mean, are people getting the idea that, like, you know what, it might not be the next Snowden, but it might be the local whistleblower in, you know, a village in the middle of nowhere who won't actually contact you because your GPG key isn't online? Is that...
So yeah, so I think there's a little bit, I mean, I've spoken to journalists, and the two sort of groups that tend to be on top of this stuff are people either who work with sources, some of whom won't work with them otherwise, right? I mean, not Snowden, but people in finance and things like that who are hip to it and are like, yeah, I ain't going down that way. And then people who have a technical background, like, again, who sort of like have the understanding to know that this is possible. Actually, I think like, speaking of pain points, right? Like, one of the things that happens a lot, and it's a reason to say you should do this all the time. One of the pain points that happens is, and one of my former colleagues, Jen Valentino, who's like one of the best reporters on this and who does it a lot, she said two things that I think are really interesting. One is my sources never know they're a source. A lot of my sources don't know they're a source. They think they're just corroborating something. And two, that very often what happens, and the really difficult transition, is when you have a long cultivated source who is maybe nobody special, right? Like, there's some source at some company and you call them up for the quote, you know, every 3 months about whatever it is. And then one day they come to you with something and you know it's a big deal. They may not know it's a big deal, right? But the problem is that if at that point you have to go, whoa, wait, Now we got to go to this other system. Now we got to do this other thing. That's when people get cold feet. That's where you lose sources. That's where you lose stories, right? Or,
work, right? That doesn't even work. You can't switch over and erase the past history of all of the.
No, and the point is, right, but the point is that in that case, so in that case, linkability is not the problem. Like, people do know that you communicate with this person. That's okay, because, you know, you've probably printed their quotes in, you know, a dozen articles already. But what you don't want is that transition to, now we're talking about something secret. So one is there's a bit of a liability. Navia's shaking her head, nodding her head, so I know I'm on the right track. You know, there's a potential liability of all of a sudden our communications go secret. And there's just the worry that you're going to scare them off because they're like, wait a sec, oh, this is a big, oh, maybe not then. Right? And like, that's the worst thing for journalists, right? So if you can start, you know, if we have the tools and resources to start people off well from the beginning and just say, look, you know, I don't care if you're sending me a quote about, you know, the company president's new car. We're going to do it this way. And that is the norm. And we have the tools that make that feasible, right? Like that is a reasonable thing to do. Then you don't have to worry about that, right? And you don't have that transition problem, and you don't have that cold feet problem as much. Yes?
Well, then to follow up on that, do you actually suggest that journalists initially start contacting potential sources or whatever using like UGP? Not say like, you know, there might be like.
Yeah, I think the only reason why I wouldn't say that is just because there's, you know, I mean, so we know this from the Snowden situation, right? Like, you are getting your sources. You have to get your sources up to speed on what you're using, right? And so, you know, I think honestly the reasons that even the journalists who understand this and really care about this don't do that already is because that would be a complete deal breaker, right? If you said to somebody, look, first you got to go to this website and you're going to download this thing called GPT and you're going to generate a key and then you're going to do this and you're going to do that, right? Like, it's just not practical. So if we can make it practical, right? If we can just say, here, look, you know, there's this plugin or there's this, you know, here's this app you use for email and like, you know, and it does the whole thing. Then why not? You know, like if it's, you know, I mean, obviously, you know, like there are plenty of apps out there for different kinds of things. I mean, email obviously presents a unique problem. Like we all know that, like why it's more challenging than other types of communication, but it certainly can be done. And, you know, even things like key exchange, like a lot of journalists still meet their sources in person, right? Like we can educate people about key exchange. Like that's not that big a deal. That's what they're doing, you know, with Silent Circle. They've got the little card that you give to somebody that's basically a Silent Circle account, you know, and they go and they sign up, they type in the thing or they scan it or whatever, and then you're done, right? And that's authenticated too, right? Like you know who that is. That's, you know, like that's the kind of model we should be looking at for putting these together. Yes.
Do you see more journalism schools investing in this type of education?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, for example, I should have mentioned this at the top. We, like the Tao Center and the Columbia Journalism School, we have a year-long research effort that we called Journalism After Snowden, where we are developing, we're working on course materials and events and all of this stuff to try to kind of get this stuff integrated because, you know, what we recognize too is that, you know, it's just, I see it as the same way that the technology community and like the first, like from 2000 to 2010 or whatever, kind of realized that like usability, right, wasn't something you stuck on top, right? Like, you know, the sort of like design is how it works. It used to be that you were like, let's make a thing and then we'll hire somebody and they're supposed to make it pretty. And over time we realized that doesn't really work, right? Make it pretty for me. And I think now what we're getting to now is we realize that like, you know, security is not the thing we're going to stick on top. Right? We're not going to say, oh, and then you do this thing, right? It's a process. That was actually what he said was security is a process, not a product, right? And so we recognize that, and I think a lot of places do. But again, you know, the expertise is small and hard to distribute, and you know that's what we're trying to help with.
I'm gonna cut it off right now, but please feel free to.
Yeah, I'll be around.
Susan, and also in this room right now, there's tons of people that actually train others and are very knowledgeable in this. So find them out. I can put them out to you too. I am gonna point out
targets on your heads
because she's one of the most important First Amendment lawyers. So if you're a journalist, please see her.
She knows all the law stuff.
Yeah.
And she's really good at explaining it.
Yeah. So thank you, Susan.
Thank you. Thank you guys very much for having me.